his body is in a condition like of somebody that just stuck their finger in a light socket, and they're like in a state of what's the word they call it? Not rigor mortis, but a place of like the charge is too much for them to just drive the nervous system in a normal way. Let's put it like that. And then consciousness goes off with it. So my point here is that we're talking about it all the way across the spectrum of the nervous system seems to be the way this experience, the potential of this experience. And I think that it's if for the people that get past the toes on the doorway step, uh, there's no possibility of thinking that the game is the same as they thought.
Good afternoon, Brian. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, sir?
I'm well, thank you. I have a topic that's been on my mind, and it's not not fully formed. So maybe I'll just lay out a couple things for you, and see what comes up. One is the most recent episode we did with Paul Fenn. Has kind of been going around in my mind because he was using liberty and democracy in a way that I think I said even in the recording that it sounded like liberty had a capital L, democracy had a capital D. Like they were values that represented some metaphysics that we were trying to get um, described. And so that's kind of one piece of like if 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 you're featuring certain core values, what are the implications for the cognitive model? And the other piece that kind of points at the same thing is I've been thinking about the differences between religions. And lately, like looking at differences between Judaism and Christianity. And one of the things um, that happens in the Old Testament over and over again is especially in the 40 years between Egypt and the Promised Land is a forgetfulness about faith. And there's this constant forgetting about God and then a reminder of God, forgetting and reminding. And I think the implications of that include that we're always searching. And I think part of the Jewish tradition is always searching, always asking, always wondering, always redefining the relationship. Leaving and coming back is a pretty common thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Christianity, it seems like the featured um, ideas are about faith and salvation, and those being having a strictness about them. Like if you if you regard Jesus Christ as the Messiah, then you can expect salvation. And that seems like a much more direct path. Um, and so what I'm curious about is how different religions or cognitive models more generally kind of program different ways of apprehending the world, of apprehending spiritual growth, um, of laying out kind of a moral foundation. And it seems like there might be considerable differences that don't necessarily get talked about a whole lot. Like we tend to say Judeo-Christian values, but I'm wondering how the differences might make for interesting differences in how how we go about things and what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I got.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's just like all of civilization.
Yeah.
Um, so we'll unfold all of civilization in 60 minutes here.
Great.
Where do we start? I think the thing that comes back to me. One of my, I always come back to these one-string banjo songs, right? And uh, the way it shows up for me is that just when we say religions that have been successful, that is, they've lasted, beyond a successor, they've got millions of adherents, there's a recognizable, what it is to be them sort of things. I think all of those traditions, they have to play out over a spectrum. It's sort of like we hear about the Masons, there's the people at the beginning, and there's getting one version of the story, and then all the way up at the top, there's people that may understand the story in a slightly different way. And then you get all these different degrees of understanding that show up there. And my picture of this is that not only does the level of the interpretation of the ancient sources or the ancient lineage depend on the individual and their where their setting is in understanding things metaphysically, you know. Um, for example, I have personally known Christians who are absolutely all in on when they die, they're going to a city and the streets are paved with gold to the point where they're saying, "Hey, don't you want to see the streets that are paved with gold?" It's like not even a decision to be made, right? Who wouldn't want to see that? And like for me, there's major hermeneutical hurdles to accept that interpretation of doctrine. Uh, and I think there's a lot of Christians that are like, yeah, in fact, probably even Aquinas might want to, loosen up on whether there's really streets and whether they really are gold and whether it would really matter if they were gold or not if you're in heaven. And so what I tend to think about, particularly with these old lineages, is we have this phenomenon that when you tell somebody a story, regardless of the level that you're telling the story, it gets heard at the level of the listener. And so, this happens with Buddhism, this happens with, throughout Christianity, this happens in fact, this is why there was originally this by Schleiermacher, this question about hermeneutics because we've got everybody with a different interpretation. And so how do we know which interpretation is the real deal and which is counterfeit coin? And uh, so I think that that's dependent on the individual and their sort of like metaphysical savvy. But I think it's also cultural. I think, for example, that, and this is what I think, when I look at the news today, I feel like a lot of it is explained by chapters and transitions and cultures at different levels of development, and that given any doctrine, a a globalist society will interpret it one way, a society that's still operating at a level of tribalism will interpret it another way. And that in a tribalist world, you're thinking more my God versus their God, particularly if you're in a fight with them over resources. Whereas in a globalist world, we want to say, well, everybody's just got a different name for God. And you see, how that translates. Like the rabbi told us that right up front in the beginning, created in the image, and that nobody's exempt from that. And uh, it's one of the things I liked about Schopenhauer is because his relationship with dogs, he felt that even dogs were in some level created in the image, that they shared a sort of a cosmic dilemma with us. And in fact, if we're talking about consciousness is spread out all over a spectrum, and we've talked about that. So I tend to think about these things as spread out over cultural and intellectual spectrums. And so, we say things like, let those who have ears hear, wink, wink. Or we have the inner circle and the outer circle. Or we have the exoteric and the esoteric. We have the uninitiated and the initiated. We have the outer temple and the inner temple. So all of those sort of reflect that there might be a spectrum of revelation, maybe. And I think that because my personal reading of all this stuff is, I'm kind of a phenomenologist in that I want to go off of my firsthand experience and interpret all the old sources that I come across in light of my personal experience. And what I realized on my particular journey, you will understand why, is that I was rapidly out of the realm where I could refer to other people's common experience with my experience. I was having experiences that maybe the average person doesn't have to include into their cognitive model, or places where they're maybe willing to take somebody's word for it. And for me, it was like, well, I want to see that. Or I want to at least see the pieces at the deepest level I can that support that interpretation. And I've said before that when I've had the highest yogic experience that I've ever had, I didn't encounter deity explaining itself to me in terms of any ancient text. The experience was blowing all the doors out, and if you were going to try to translate it into a propositional message, it would be something like, "This is it," with a lot of those monist implications about the it, as in there's nothing that's not it, and this is all of it. And as a human experience, it's your nervous system. And this is one of the things that I constantly tell people, that how my model differs from a lot of people's. A lot of people think that enlightenment is an intellectual experience. Oh, and now the payload is going to be different. And my personal experience is that it was the things that I experienced, which, as I've expressed before, is we're talking toes on the threshold. I'm not trying to claim any attainment, just like a little glimpse through a tear in the fabric, or the veil is maybe better said. Um, that my nervous system was just pinned. So the way that shows up in your optic circuits is just lots of white light. And so then, oh, that's why they talk about white light, because the nervous system is just pinned, right? I've seen pictures of yogis. There's a famous picture of Sri Ramana Maharishi, and he's got some mudras going, and he's standing in a position, and you might look at this and say, oh, there he is. He's standing, he's making these gestures. But what the yogis explained to me was, no, he's like, his body is in a condition like of somebody that just stuck their finger in a light socket. And they're like in a state of what's the word they call it? Not rigor mortis, but a place of like, the charge is too much for them to just drive the nervous system in a normal way. Let's put it like that. And then consciousness goes off with it. So my point here is that we're talking about it all the way across the spectrum of the nervous system seems to be the way this experience, the potential of this experience. And I think that it's, if for the people that get past the toes on the doorway step, there's no possibility of thinking that the game is the same as they thought beforehand. With just the toes on the, the whole model has to change. And so that, but I'm not going to argue like we've had people, I'm not going to argue with the bottom uppers because there's nothing I can bring. I can't say, well, when that, because I know they don't know when that, because I didn't know when that until this very unusual thing occurred. But then the descriptions of other people through time started to make sense. And I was asking a big cosmic WTF, and had later some texts show up in my hands that went bing, 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 bing. And I could go, oh. And then later I talked to a pretty high level old Tibetan monk who explained some things to me. And it was like, oh, okay. So this isn't just an aberration, Oh. But I don't know. Did that get in there somewhere
It's
about the?
relevant. Yeah. Um, I want to go back to a few things you said and maybe tug on them. Earlier on, you were talking about, different people hear the same story and um, it gets interpreted differently based on kind of what their level of consciousness is, what spin they have on the ball, what culture they come from, all kinds of things. And so I wanted to go back and recap something we've talked about before, but maybe there's like a new element to it, which is how we create meaning through narrative and how like why why would somebody say that all meaning is created through narrative, which is maybe parallel to all meaning is context based, which is something we've said on this show before. So that's especially interesting in light of different people deriving different meaning from the same story because they're creating a different narrative internally relative to that story. Can
Well,
you say more
because
about that?
they have to come to completion, right? They have to fit that new piece into their cognitive model. It's a given that their cognitive model is a different map. It's got a lot of overlaps, If we share a language, there's an overlap. If we come from the same country, there's an overlap. But still fundamentally distinct and
So
unique.
we're saying the cognitive model is essentially a meta story, and new information has to get incorporated into it as a chapter here or a sentence there that
Like a
it
super meta story, right? To the point where, like, this is one of the things I brought up before, and I don't know that we've really squeezed all the juice out, but this idea of reality having a basic linguisticality. And that linguisticality, the way I heard this described, and I just saw it just went by fast, and I didn't get a hold of it, but it was the idea that everything in our universe that we come across or can distinguish from every other thing is a narrative, which is an interesting way to think about it. So when we talk about meta narrative, we're talking about this basket woven of all of the narratives of all of the things that you could point to, and as many or more things that you can't point to, but that are implied through
w-
culture, through meanings.
what does that mean? So I point to the moon. Why is it a narrative, not a thing? What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means that when you point to the moon, you see, maybe you believe that we went to the moon, so you've got all the backstory that gets triggered. And this is also interesting because Peterson lays this out. This is the back end of the conversation about what makes creative thought. How does a creative person think creatively, and how do we even think about that? And the basic gist of it is you take a seed idea, right? And that seed idea is going to wake up a bunch of proximal associations to it. The more creative thinkers will generate more associations with that seed idea. They'll do it faster, but most importantly, they'll make connections that are more distal. They'll make leaps that are harder for less creative people to follow. And that's, like one of the things that our whole show is about doing that with ideas, right? It's like, well, this is like this, which is like, because a lot of language is analogy. And so, and this is part of the aspect about meaning. Well, what part of meaning is that it's an accurate map, that it gets us to the place in Norway that we're trying to get to. So it's got to have those critical details. We may miss having all the bushes on the way and the good restaurants and but so we have this cognitive model that's a meta narrative that's woven together dimensionally in a way that, when we say narrative, it implies A to B, B to C, C to D, and it goes, but this is just, we've referred to plates of spaghetti before, but this is like, this is a big plate of big spaghetti, and so everybody's is unique. And so the string of associations that will come up, a lot of them will be the same because there's a lot of aspects that aren't unique with, shared languages, shared customs, shared parts of countries and but the idea is that if we had the whole model, a lot of it would be unique to this person. Neurolinguistic programming tells us that we take experience and we do basically three things to it. We generalize it, we delete parts, and we distort parts. Well, everybody does that with their own curve on the ball, and the way that they do that is based on the pages of the book that went down before that impacted not just the data of their cognitive model, but their mechanisms for metabolizing the data and then calling it up and associating it.
That
So,
that's very much true.
everybody in London knows, the map of London, but not like a London cabbie, right? He's got to have a facility. He's got to have a creative grasp of that knowledge that the average person just needs to know how to get home, how to get to the main places, how to get to, and it isn't even that important if they get caught in a traffic snarl or if they know the back ways or, but so the idea is we get creative and we win facility in the world by having the right patterns for metabolizing that data of our cognitive model and for parsing those narratives, which is interpretation, which is why we harp on the H word all the time. That rather than analytics and proving propositions, the average person needs to have facility with interpretation in the face of uncertainty, not winning certainty out of every little fact. You don't have time for that. Life is too short. Look at this, for God's sakes, right?
The H
So
word being hermeneutics.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Meaning that, as we've said before, Hermes was the messenger god. And so this idea of conveying the message across languages, across time, across cultures, from mind to mind, that transmission, since we don't have that Vulcan thing going. And since, as Schopenhauer reminded us, all the great teachers are dead anyway. So, uh, so how we translate that's why it was initially focused as a problem of literature and how do we interpret ancient literature. And it was really, I think, the phenomenologists and Gadamer in particular that really explicated this idea of everything we do is interpretive. And literally, to bring it to your question, what do we do? Well, everything that we do, according to Gadamer, is related directly to our interpretations. In fact, the act of doing itself is interpreting the narratives, and that he directly connects to Aristotle's phronesis. I have the quote on my phone here, but I won't bother to dig it out. You know, um,
the the next thing I wanted to go back to is you talked about your model kind of being going after direct experience yourself and then being able to kind of compare that to the other experiences that have been described through history and kind of use that as a reference point. And that's been the case for me as well. And I've been thinking about, in light of my original question, like, what is it about my cognitive model that throws me toward direct experience? Is that something that I was born with, or is that the result of meaning making that I've done because of whatever catalysts I've encountered? And it makes me think of both of us as orphans, and the searching that is part of our cognitive model, surely as a result of that. And I'm just curious what you think about the relationship between, like, where does your seeking direct experience come from? Maybe is the way to do that.
That's a great question. Um, I suppose there's good theories there. I almost wanted to go into past lives and, remembering stuff, but that would be really out there. My suspicion is that if I had to find a this lifetime explanation, we could go in the orphans get gaslit a lot. So they come to take things with a certain quantity of sodium chloride. And then there's the other phenomenon that sort of can confound the situation. And that is that if you cognitively score in the top 1 or 2%, then there's a good chance that you're not going to be satisfied with the resolution of a lot of the cognitive models that are floating around in your world. And you're gonna realize that some of them don't even really work that well. I was thinking about I was thinking about an event. I'll tell the story because he's deceased at this point, but I was probably, I don't know, 8 years old, 10 years old, something like that. Old enough to be precocious, but young enough to still be kind of innocent about it, And my father, my adopted father, had some friends over, which wasn't a common occurrence, but, they were having dinner or something like that, and they had brought a bottle of wine, and they had this new, my parents had this new corkscrew device. And this corkscrew was such that it had a handle that flipped on it, so that you flipped it one way and it connected to the screw so you could drive it into the cork, but then you flipped it around and it threaded on on the threads of the screw that would retract the the cork from the vessel. Yes. And so my father wrestled with this for a while, and to me, cognitively, it was like, and I, without thinking, said, "Oh no, it's like this here, and and so my EQ was not as high as my IQ. Let's put it that way. And the shitstorm that I got, and I honestly, I wasn't trying to make anybody look bad. I was in that, wow, look, I can figure this out, kind of that, innocent spirit that must be crushed, you know? And so, so anyway, you start to realize that maybe not everybody's getting squeezing the same juice out of everything that you are. And that maybe you better test some of their conclusions if they're really important. And so maybe that made me, and I think also on the religious front, I took people at their word, and I can remember having some conversations with a Lutheran minister and a Methodist minister as I was growing up and being indoctrinated in those particular lineages. And it just ultimately wasn't that convincing to me. It seemed like a franchise business. and I didn't get to where anybody was translating this to anything beyond the material. Seemed like a social club, you know? And I didn't get necessarily that, it's like the morality moves with the bell curve. And there's a gravity. I think we talked about this uh with Rich Rubino in the last episode that I think will be right before this one, and talking about the Weebles, how once things get past a certain point, there's a type of inertia that pulls them back to the center, and so I saw most people just kind of hugging around that center, leaving the safety of the herd, even to act more morally, even though there was a clear spiritual teaching that there was a different degree of morality than you experience being exercised. Getting away from the herd is not a safe feeling. Whereas for me, and maybe this does connect with the orphan thing, being in the herd is not a safe feeling, and that creates that avoidant type of attachment
Mhm.
uh, theory or style, I guess they
Yeah,
call it, if you want to.
attachment style.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've been looking at how my search for direct experience with ideas, spirituality, um, things like that have often entailed conflict, whether it was with my father growing up, or in various relationships that I've had, and kind of asking myself how much am I looking for conflict as much as spiritual experience when I'm
Hmm.
seeking direct experience. So definitely like asking, what is it about me that drives seems like both of those in parallel, which is kind of interesting to think about those together.
Well, and it's
Um,
that eggshell thing that we spoke about with Rabbi Schlechter, uh, that if people don't have the courage to leave the safety of the flock to go to some of those places that I went to, I won't label them necessarily as extreme, but that's what the current cultural model might call them, uh, then they probably shouldn't. And, maybe a lot of us have these experiences in college, but I can remember having some experiences that I came away with, uh, having with major ahas, and having seen some other people that maybe didn't come away as healthy from it. And
quite
maybe
the
that is
contrary. Yeah.
that many are called, but few are chosen. Or what it wasn't ripe yet, or wasn't, time for that, and that's why I'm, always very quick to say, or I try to be quick to say, you know, first of all, I'm not a materialist. So one of the ways that translates is I don't believe that the compound, whatever medicinal compound, if one's trying to use that to alter their consciousness, I don't believe that has fundamentally much to do with it. Yes, it may shift your consciousness, but it's not necessarily going to shift it in the right direction unless you have some preset. And, the way that showed up for me was, doing psychotherapy and learning about psychotherapy, studying psychology, working with certain traditions that would reveal myself to myself, maybe plugging some holes in the boat a little bit, and maybe uh, redefining my relationship with fear and with security, and which is already, you know in the orphan condition, you already have a slightly different relationship with those, and it's a challenging one, and a lot of people don't come out well from it. And I do feel like while I'm very clear about how the negative implications of it, and it took years for it to dawn on me, I know that I'm one of the lucky ones. Absolutely. And so part of that luck may be in having used the challenges to develop certain capacities that hopefully your boat doesn't get swamped by them. Because there are some hard points to it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, interesting. Um, one other topic that you touched on that I thought we might explicate a little further is the physicality of spiritual experience. And that's something that I picked up on probably from you the most. But it's no coincidence that another spiritual teacher was also an acupuncturist and herbalist, and so was very tuned into the the let's say the ether between the physical and the spiritual. So I you said some things about it, but I wanted to circle back and see if there's more to mind there, because I didn't agree that most people think spiritual experience is intellectual, as in rational, like a result of thought. But but we do have a default mental model in our culture, I think, that a spiritual experience is, say, in the head. It doesn't mean it's thinking or rational, but it's not of the body. Um,
Right.
and for you, it very much is. And maybe the martial arts background is part of that, or the Reichian therapy, or I mean, all of it. But
I
say more
think it
about that.
I think that this is the way the human nervous system works, and that the the experience of Kundalini rising through the body is, think of an orgasm times 100, or the way the way that I've had it described. Uh, and this was my experience, so this is not coming just from a description, but that it's like that basically you're coming out of the top of your head into the universe, and that as the energetic experience is of the member to the whole physical body, that's the energetic difference, that the coital energetic experience is very localized. Although you get into Reich and he'll say, well, if the body's right, the organism moves through the whole body. And yes, that's true, but not like a Kundalini experience. And this is also one of my other banjo songs, is that meditation isn't just about quietude, that that part of the conscious, part of this dispositional shift, uh, it requires a lot of energy. And that's why yogis tend to be celibate. Not because there's anything, bad about physicality. No, because they got that money, that energetic money is spent already on this big project that they have, and that's why they don't want to spend. I use that term spending because that's one of the traditional Chinese internal arts ideas, is to refer to it as spending. And the idea, you only have so much money, so don't just be slap happy here like a drunken sailor or like a government. As a sailor stops when he's out of money, right? so so um but so energy is an important part of that function, and that's why internal arts, it's not just about I'm going to relax. A lot of people, they end up with what we call tofu tai chi if they think it's just about relaxing. It's not just about the silk, it's about the steel that the silk is wrapped around. Silk isn't what hits you, it's the steel that hits you, right? So all of that is based on a full energetic body. right? And it's hard to know what that means really as a physical experience till you've gone through quite a bit of training and you've actually got your body doing stuff and you're going, well, that's kind of bizarre. Like you're walking around in Anchorage, Alaska in the wintertime in a t-shirt for 45 minutes, and the steam is rolling off of you and you're not feeling cold. Right, and then, and you'll know when you stop, all of a sudden, you better get as many layers on as you came in, but that's, like, not a normal thing. Same thing with Kundalini yoga, you do that right, your body will heat up, and
So
you
connect
know
that to the spiritual. So that's like a good glimpse into what the physical practice looks like and results in, maybe more results in.
right.
But if you're um, affecting both the silk and the steel, are you having a spiritual experience? Are you just more primed for a spiritual experience, or what's the connection there?
Yeah, I think you're probably just I wonder, that's a great question. Most people that practice internal arts, I never see them get to this level, it's very rare. Maybe the very best students of some of the very best teachers.
There's an awful lot of ego in that world.
There's that, and there's also just a lot of magical thinking, and the magical thinking makes it easy to fool yourself, and if you're not somebody who's used to working very hard, and if you're not uh, a farmer, you're probably not used to working hard enough. You're probably not gonna do this stuff long enough to get the transformation in the body that you need to have it operate the way that. But, Reiki therapy is a very similar thing. It's the essence of this energy is breath, and in certain when the conditions are right, you will feel that your breath connects to your chi, and you can feel the chi flow all the way out to the fingertips. And that's the kind of thing that a master at a certain level discovered and came back and said, okay, how do we scaffold our way up to that? Well, and a lot of these people were energetically gifted, you might say. So then they were able to help the rest of us figure our way up there. But so, so, if you think of, well, with the Kabbalah, they will lay the tree of life along the body. With some of the yogic traditions, we have the Sushumna in the center, and we have the Ida and the Pinglala, which are often shown in Hermetic traditions as the snakes that are winding their way up, right? And then we have stations along there that uh, uh, are like
Chakra.
markers of certain levels of energetic transformation of the root energy. So, everybody's got that most root energy. Most people, unless you have a congenital condition, most people can reproduce. It comes right off the tree really early, right? And that's the most physical. In Chinese medicine, they'll refer to that level as the jing, the essence, meaning the most material of the three treasures. But but you could think about it like you know how when they're making gasoline out of petroleum, you know how they do that? They have a tree, and it starts out as crude at the bottom, and as it heats up, the fumes go up that tree, and the very first one I think that comes off is like kerosene or something like that, and the very tippy top of the tree is jet fuel. And then you've got your different stages of gasoline. Race car fuel is under your jet fuel, and then you get into your high test, and you come down the tree back down towards kerosene. Well, it's
I
almost like,
I think I remember learning, when 9/11 happened that jet fuel was much closer to kerosene than we think, but the
oh,
so so
could be.
that might
Yeah.
not be exactly the case, but there is that levels of refinement for sure.
And they translate that to octane, higher and higher octane as you go
Yeah.
up. And octane is basically just the bang inside the juice.
How much energy you get per gallon. Yeah.
Exactly. Juice bang is the technical term. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I think that the human nervous system works a similar way. But we are, and I've mentioned this before, that, if you jab an amoeba under a microscope, you'll see him close up and you go, well, and we have, the amoeba just has one center because he's only got one cell, right? So his energetic economy is based in the expansion and contraction of that single cell. But we have all these different centers. We're way more complicated, and we go through stages of development that are relevant to these different centers. With Reich, we start out at an anal stage, or rather, we start out at a ocular stage, and then we end up finally at a genital stage. Um, moving through these other chapters, but generally there's this idea that the energy at the bottom is at the grossest level. That's where the poop comes out, right? And then we go all the way up to the third eye and the top of the head. And I think I might have experienced that, or might have mentioned before, that the thing that happened to me happened when I put my head back and went from the throat chakra, not including these two. And that's why I say this was just the toes just getting a glimpse through the window crack, but enough to make sense out of some of the models that led up at least to that place. And so each one of these different stations is a place that the energy can get tied up. I think in yoga they use the word granthi, which means a knot. And so in Reiki and therapy, that's one of the things that they're trying to do, is see the energy moving through these different stations or body segments, and see if it's not moving through. There's usually, what that means is that you have a condition that I've referred to as having the gas and the brakes on at the same time, which is to say you're using energy back against your own energy. And what that does is that creates a state of tension, a state of chronic tension that they refer to as armoring. And so you could see where if somebody was doing the right internal practices and they're doing an internal art and they're moving well, they may start to melt that armoring. But if it's really in there as a knot, probably not.
I just want to pause there and posit that physical gas and brakes on at the same time and armoring, I would hypothesize that correlates to um, elements in the cognitive model that are also armoring the psyche. So what that means is stories that we tell ourselves or beliefs that we have that are also in conflict and keep us in a double bind psychologically as well. And that physical and let's call that psychological. Those planes are both reflections of one human experience. Say,
And that's why they often will get referred to as, you have the physical body, you have the energetic body, you have the emotional body, you have the intellectual body. And you can see how all those get reflected, or a thing that happens through the different levels. And I think that it can move both ways. And that you certainly can be psychically impacted by things that happen to you, and vice versa, right? So even though we might want to call the second kind psychosomatic, and there's the two halves. Talk about the mind body problem. That's it right there. Psychosomatic,
yeah, and
mind
yet
body.
placebos work shockingly well.
Yeah, and so does the mind, when trained in certain lineages, manifest the ability to control certain things that are not normally controllable. Whether we're talking about Milarepa sitting in a snow cave across the winter using Tumo to keep himself warm, or Wim Hof, who seems to have a version of the same thing going on. or there's a number of those things. If anybody's into reading fun books, check out Alexandra David Neal, uh, Neel. She was traveled in Tibet and Nepal and in disguise in the 1920s and maybe into the 30s, and writes about it, magic and mystery in Tibet, and is definitely worth checking out. Alexandra
Cool.
David Neal,
Yeah,
hyphenated
we'll
David
put it in
Neal.
the show notes.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe let's close out by circling back to the top, if you'll humor me. And I'm still chewing on this idea of Judeo-Christian values and wondering how much those really should be mushed together. Um, and and I'm also thinking about um, who was it that said there are Christian atheists and Jewish atheists. Um, were, was that something that we heard together, or did I pick that up on my own? I
Yeah,
might have picked.
I haven't
Oh, it was
heard that. I
Jonathan
haven't.
Sacks. Jonathan Sacks
Okay.
said it to Richard Dawkins because
Okay.
Dawkins was saying, I'm a cultural Christian," and Sacks was like, "Yeah, there are absolutely Christian atheists and there are Jewish atheists, and what that means is that different cognitive models at a cultural level are getting passed on to people whether they lead secular lives or not." And so
Sure.
curious what you
Sure.
think about
Yeah.
Judeo-Christian as a mushed together idea and how much utility that has.
Well, once we've gotten into, like, if you remember these are traditions that came out of prophecy. Islam's in there too. And which means that I've referred to the two different types of Buddhism as myself power and trusting others. And so we have the same sort of thing going on here. We've got, Saint Francis of Assisi, you know, who we could say, I'm told that in the Hindu traditions they have the concept of being drunk with God, and that they can kind of recognize that. And it's like, yeah, kind of crazy. He's not maybe going to be on time with the rent all the time, but he's got something else going on that's different than just somebody who's on a bad trip. And so when you're trying to, in Buddhism there is this concept that's called true believing, and it sort of presupposes sincerity on both sides of the transmission. That I mean, it's pretty clear that St. Francis was all in. Right. From what we hear about his lifestyle, he didn't have a game investment in his picture of things. But that's not always clear, right? And so there's this idea that we have to be getting it has to be true believing, so that we're actually getting the download of a sincere person who's trying to translate from their genuine experience something that they know from this experience that it would behoove you to act as if. And because you don't have firsthand knowledge, so you are trusting in others. And so you are saying that, okay, well, this person has glimpsed something I haven't. So it seems like it's really important. So I'm going to take on the as if. And whether you're believing the scripture, or you're believing the prophet who wrote the scripture, or you're believing the tradition that interpreted the scripture written by the prophet, or it all sort of, collectively works into, we've tested this as ifness and it seems to pay out. And which is a kind of a pragmatic, but what can you do if you're not glimpsing it yourself? Now you've got a much larger hermeneutical task in some ways than the prophet who saw it for themselves, and they've got no easy task to try to flatten that out into something that. In fact, one of the stories in Buddhism is that they say that when the Buddha attained enlightenment, that he sat for 4 days and he didn't say a thing. and they said that the Devis and the Dakinis and all the good spirits and everything, they're like, "What's going on, dude? You gotta communicate this, you know?" And but it's like, where what do you say? Because just kind of by definition, it is ineffable. And so you start with parables, I guess, or you start with analogies, or you start saying things that sound like Parmenides. So then the one both is and is not both the same and not the same as itself. Exactly. Or and this is one of the things that good mystical traditions, whether you were talking about, any of them, there is a certain science to it. And that is that you do have those antepasados, those who have literally passed before you, though they may not be many, that by manifesting their attainment, you feel pretty good that what they were trying to communicate was the real deal. So that means that your task is the hermeneutical one. You know it's in there. You just don't know exactly what the implications and all of the nuances of all of the terms, but you've got a scent at least to follow. And now you do some work and you keep churning and fomenting and maybe getting more pieces, and then the idea is that then maybe your own aha comes, and that the G, the technique, turns into the re, the inspiration, which is a thing that we haven't talked about, which is another Japanese thing, which is it's kind of what we're talking about here, and it's called uh, shuhari, and the shu means basically learn or obey. I think it can also be translated as protect, which has this idea of don't deviate it. But then the ha part is break away. And it implies that, we've talked about Nietzsche's prolegomena, about the camel that goes out into the desert, and that and he's loaded up. That's the shoe part, where he's getting all this data that's not first person experience, but somehow his cognitive model that he builds out of that in the desert. This doesn't just happen anywhere. This is in the desert, which means what? You're on your own. You don't know what you're going to come across, probably not going to be friendly. And there's probably not just going to be easy resources laying out all over the place. So you might have some scrambling to do. You're going to really test your cognitive model that you've loaded up. Because if you don't have it on you packed up when you're in the desert, you don't have it. So out of that, is where that breakaway happens that enables the camel to get transmuted into the lion that can fight with the dragon that says thou shalt. Well, when he kills the dragon, he's attained that breakaway stage, right? And the ha stage, but there's still one more stage to go, which is the re stage. And the restage, it gets translated usually as like release or transcend, but it means that now there's a whole other game that has gone on through this path that was broken away from, that you started out bound to through learning and protecting, and then having to break away and to be able to transcend. So there's an interesting process there, and I think
And
this
that, of
works
course,
exactly the same way.
is the baby in the Nietzsche version.
In the Nietzsche version, that's when the baby shows up, which is this idea only then are you truly born as who you are, when you've gone through that transcension. Only then are you the thought that that you express for reality on its behalf when it begat you. Yeah,
As
like that.
opposed to being the the cognitive model that, you've essentially outsourced until fighting the dragon.
Right. I mean, that's the safe way is you're out there when you come across the dragon, you just go the other way because you're not gonna make that leap to really own it, to really own yourself, you know? And this ties into, which I was thinking about today, was, Martin Heidegger. And he has a whole thing about inauthenticity and you know, his deal was being and temporality. And one of his things was that, well, temporality is an aspect of being because things be for a duration. And that's the nature of temporality. It isn't infinite, even though we can pose it as infinite, we don't experience it as infinite. So for him, we get, he had this idea that he called das Man, the man. And it's very similar to the idea of the man that happened in the 60s. I can't say whether that came out of it directly, I wonder. But this idea of Das Man is all the stuff that gets loaded onto you in that shoe phase. That's your culture, that's your religion, that's your family, that's your social class, that, you know, all that stuff.
Everything that constitutes your foot being nailed down in a particular room, in a particular house, on a particular street.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so for Heidegger, that condition he calls inauthenticity, and that he says that it's directly connected to our living without realizing death. And that realizing our finality, realizing our that we exist in this finite temporality. You know, we go into this mental place that says that, well, you know, there were 1,000,000 years before now and there'll be 1,000,000 years after now. Yeah, but not for you, sucker, right? You're here and now, and that means at some point you will be not here and not now. And that's his point, is that realization of our death. This is why the fool dances with death, which is a whole fun theme, right? Uh, is the doorway, the portal to your authenticity. That in fact, the argument is made that our life is lived from the perspective of knowing that we approach our death inexorably, and that's actually an aspect of meaning, which comes back to your question about how that happens. And so, how does our cognitive model come to empower our authenticity in such a way that we become who we are? You know, we're told by some philosophers that if we become who we are radically enough, it will change the whole world around us. And I think that's some truth to that, right? So, you know,
I'm
there's a good
hoping.
argument to say that's the only game in town, right?
That's yeah, otherwise I've been, barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, well, there's that. Yeah, and you know, then the other thing I've been thinking about, uh, which is Camus saying that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, which is a leap maybe, but the back d dovetails into that, you know, for folks unfamiliar with Sisyphus, he's the Greek god, or what god, no, brunt of a
Victim,
divine
yeah.
joke, victim, who was, committed to, as punishment, to push this rock up the hill only to have it roll down and have to turn around and do the same thing again. And Camus wrote a whole book about it called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is kind of interesting. It's significant in that it says that he sort of poses the question, you know, is life worth living? And your answer is you living it. So when you get up in the morning, what you're doing is your statement of saying that life is worth living because this, right? Well, I would suggest that you're going to have the best and richest time doing that having the richest cognitive model that you can have and having the highest capacity of facility in working with that model and squeezing the right juice out of it hermeneutically. There, I said the H word.
Yeah. Um, well, I think we probably want to wrap here, but maybe
Mhm.
I'll put a pin in your last comment and how it relates to this idea of privilege, um, and how that's been used as sort of a political um, divisor, or I guess in some cases philosophy, right? There's a philosophy of privilege, and if you imagine Sisyphus happy, surely you have a different understanding of privilege than thinking that it might have been he might have been oppressed, or whatever else you want to do with that metaphor. So I think that might be worth coming back to just because it's timely.
Yeah, yeah, there's an interesting thing there. And, uh and I also wanted to mention, because part of that idea of privilege is, as Thoreau reminded us, he said to be born rich is to be stillborn. A lot of it is for that reason, that you're gonna have an impoverished set of experiences because they will be so elite that they will lack leverage on revealing the human condition, because you're getting just such a slice of it that's mostly the cherry pie parts, or seems to be.
Seems to be, exactly. Right, that's the
And
rub.
yeah, but so there is this question about, uh, um, how does one equip oneself? How does one live one's life in the way that equips one to transcend it, to the highest meaning? And that's, we've got all these great minds before that have wrestled with this, so they definitely help.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian.
Thank you, sir. And oh, and I wanted to mention, we've got episodes up on our audio bookshelf of the aforementioned Thoreau. So if you want to check out Walden or Life in the Woods, without having to turn the pages yourself while you're scrubbing the dog or whatever else is you do during your day, without needing to read it, we've got it up there, and we're going to drop an episode. I think there's 9, so we'll be dropping them every week. And, yeah, I think
All
that's
right.
the only. Do we have any other fun housekeeping notes? I don't think so. Um, just stay tuned.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.